When you're teaching using Adobe Connect, it's important to try to recreate a face-to-face instructional environment as much as possible while still being aware that you're obviously not in a face-to-face environment and some modifications need to be made. Understand that many of the participants will have very little, if any, experience learning in an online-only environment. So this will be new to them, and it could be intimidating. When I teach a face-to-face class, I like to spend time before class in the hallway in front of the classroom, shaking hands, commiserating with students as they arrive. And that's a process that you can duplicate in Adobe Connect using something I call a lobby template. A lobby template is essential in helping you establish your instructor presence at the very outset of the event that you're presenting. There are a number of things that should go on in this lobby room. First, arrive in this space early, maybe 15 minutes or so before the event is actually scheduled to begin. Be sure that you are there and present, because some users will arrive early and will want to see someone else there. When you see new users arrive in the attendees box, welcome them. Have an available chat window or chat pod opened up, and as you see people trickle into the attendees list, welcome them to the space. This is kind of like shaking someone's hand when they enter a room, acknowledging their presence. I also encourage you to consider having an active poll up and visible and active for the users when they first arrive. And when you see them arrive, invite them to participate in the poll. That poll can allow you to glean some very valuable information from the participants, information that you can act on during the course of the session, or that you can use to help avoid any problems or conflicts that might arise during the course of the session. So for example, down here, I have an active poll that says, what are you hoping to take away from today's session? And it's an open-ended poll, and if I see users responding in a way that indicates that they don't have a clear understanding of what the session is going to cover, I can make sure once the session begins in my introduction to clearly set the objectives for the day so that the users will stay engaged and won't feel like they're not getting something that they were expecting. I can also use this space to gauge my users' prior knowledge on the content area that I'm going to be discussing. I can understand what experiences and biases they are bringing to the session, and I can, as an instructor, try to act on that feedback in the presentation itself or in this lobby area before the presentation begins. It's critical that you do that you act on the feedback that you get from the users. It shows that you're engaged, it shows that you are present with them, and it helps to recreate that more human connection that you have in a face-to-face learning environment. It's also valuable to encourage users to interact with each other at this stage before the session begins. Encourage them to share their physical location, what their hometown is, where they are. Talk about the weather in their locality. Any of these little small talk things can break down a lot of barriers that might exist and that are more difficult to overcome when we are not in the same physical space. Once the session is scheduled to begin, be sure that you start the session on time and let there be a physical change in the Adobe Connect setup. So use a different template for your presentation. It might be a prefab template that Adobe Connect comes with, or it might be something that you've custom made for your session. I'll switch into this one that I've called my Collaborate or collaboration template, and there, I've made a number of modifications to it that I will share as we go through. First, the webcam option is active. I'm not sharing my webcam currently, but I would encourage you to consider doing so when you do your sessions. Being able to put a face to the presenter is a really valuable tool for the instructor to, again, help reiterate that instructor presence, which is so critical to a quality connection between the instructor and the distance participants. Once the session is fully underway, It's very critical that you have a recurring engagement with the participants, and that's a difficult thing to accomplish. There are a number of ways that you can do it. One thing that I would strongly advise is that you have a second participant or a second host who is there to assist in your presentation. Having a second in your room with you will allow you to have a more personal presence in the Q&A pod. It will allow you to make sure that people who are engaging in the chat are getting responses. And if people ask questions in the Q&A or in the chat, you will be notified of it without having to constantly monitor that. I would advise you that you would establish some means of communication between the assistant and yourself so that if a question comes in or if a document is shared, the assistant can in some way indicate that to you. I'd also encourage you to really think hard about the layout of your template before you begin. Ask yourself, what is the ultimate outcome of this presentation? If I really want my users to engage in the chat box, I need to make that a more prominent pod in the template. If I really want my users to see my screen and to understand what I'm demonstrating, then I need to make that the most prominent box. Do I need to have the webcam on? Is that essential? Do I need to have a place where I'm including links to external websites? Is that essential? Ask all these questions in advance and establish a template that matches that feel so that it's basically you building a classroom for yourself. Think about what are the tools that you are going to rely on the most and make sure that they are displayed prominently within your template. Now let's consider some of the specific tools that you might use once the session is fully underway. First, do all you can to make frequent use of the poll pod. So let's take a look at the poll pod. Here it is. Now you might wish to have it available in your template before the session begins. I would strongly recommend that. Don't rely simply on multiple choice questions or on multiple answer questions. They are very valuable and they're a way to very quickly, from a large group of people, glean some general responses. Have you ever done something like this in your class before? Yes or no? Or true or false? Those types of things can help you really gauge the attentiveness and the understanding of your audience. But don't forget about the short answer question. This type of poll question is valuable because it will allow users to express themselves and it will allow you to see their responses in real time and to act on them meaningfully. The Q&A pod can be very valuable for you to emphasize the fact that you want this to be a dialogic session. You do not want this Adobe Connect session to be a one-way street. Whether or not you have a second who's available to help as an assistant, you should still have a Q&A pod active and you should make frequent use of it. That's a slightly different than the chat pod. I would encourage you to use the chat pod as a place where users can be perhaps more social or can make reference to things that they've experienced similar to what you're talking about in the presentation. Also, to the extent possible and to the extent that it makes sense with the type of presentation that you're doing, use the file sharing pod and use it wisely. So have some prepared documents that you know at 5 or 10 or 20 minutes into the session, I'm going to want to talk about this article that I've reviewed, or I'm going to want to talk about this PowerPoint that my colleague has shared with me. Have that prepared and ready, and be ready to upload those files into the file sharing pod. That can be very valuable because you can then say, let's all look at this file together. And it becomes a more dynamic and engaged environment. Also consider using the web links. Don't ignore the fact that your users are sitting at an internet-connected computer. That's a very powerful tool. So consider doing all these things, all in an effort to drive home the fact to your participants that you are an instructor who values their feedback, who acts on their feedback, and who is responsive to their needs and desires as learners. If you can do that, I think you'll find that you have a very successful Adobe Connect session.